Neoliberalisme het van die wêreldelite en ook ons ANC-regering uitbuiters gemaak, sê die stigtersleier van COSATU en oud-minister Jay Naidoo. In sy nuwe boek Change verduidelik hy hoekom ware politieke verandering van grondvlak af boontoe moet plaasvind. Mr. Naidoo, welcome. You quote a conversation with Chris Hani, the SSCP leader, shortly before his murder in April 1993, where he expressed the fear that the liberators might emerge as elitists driving Mercedes-Benz, gathering riches. Is this what we've become?
I think Chris Hani had a crystal ball. He saw it, and I think that's what we're rapidly descending to, particularly given the latest fiascos around the social grants payment and nuclear deal and Nenegate. I think we're certainly going down a trajectory towards a state that will be failing its citizens.
But there was a time when COSATU, a movement you were instrumental in founding, was a check on the exercise of government power. That's not the case today.
No, unfortunately, it's not the case. I think COSATU today is very different to the COSATU then. But understand that I was the one that led the COSATU as an organization into an alliance with the ANC and the SACP. But remember the context. The context in 1990, we were basically teetering on the brink of a racial civil war in this country. We needed to anchor the democracy, and that alliance was premised on a program of reconstruction and development, which meant that the primary objective of the alliance was a program to deliver democracy and the basic needs of people: jobs, education, quality health, and a better quality of life. Unfortunately, that program was abandoned in 1996, and that's when I say that mortal sin about destroying a social consensus and bringing on what today we could very aptly describe as a neoliberal dispensation in the country.
You're very critical of the way in which we have followed this global movement towards neoliberalism. You bemoan the fact that inequality is rising worldwide. Thomas Piketty wrote about this also. You cite growing unemployment and discord even in Western countries, and yet you argue that this is reversible. How?
Well, I think first it requires an acknowledgement that we have a problem. And today in the World Economic Forum acknowledges, alongside the IMF and the World Bank, that inequality is not a good thing for the world. It's increasingly creating a more fragile world where the vast majority of particularly young people are feeling marginalized and excluded. They're ending up being Uber taxi drivers even when they are highly educated. So I think we're at a point in the world where increasingly policymakers and people who think strategically understand we cannot continue in this unsustainable way.
Young people are in South Africa and elsewhere at the forefront of articulating some of these concerns. And yet, you write about the student movement in this country in a way as a movement without leaders, a leaderless movement. You criticize the violence which is estranging some people from what you regard as a legitimate cause. I mean, how ought young people to fight a system which they believe is rigged against them?
Well, firstly, let's look at what are the conditions that face us today, the subjective conditions. 1 in 3 people goes to bed hungry. That's 14 million people in South Africa that tonight will not have enough food to eat. There's 1 in 3 people unemployed. Now, what can we describe as human dignity or democracy when a parent is unable to put food 3 times a day on the table for their children? And linked to that, we have 1 in 3 people dependent on a social grant. Democracy is not working for young people, and increasingly they are raising their voices. Unfortunately, in a context where leaders that are supposed to be addressing these grave crises are more busy enriching themselves and deepening the crisis in our country, and young people feel that the leadership in business, in trade unions, in civil society, and particularly in government have abandoned them. So it's a very dangerous situation we're entering where, in a sense, what we've seen on the ground, we are the protest capital of the world. And people are protesting about basic rights. And what happens in that, in the absence of leadership responding, violence takes place. Violence becomes the language. When it starts happening in our universities, we should be getting up as South Africans and saying there's something happening that is serious and could be our biggest nightmare.
So, but democratic dogma dictated for more than a generation that the ballot box was the site, the appropriate site for these battles, right? That if you had a concern with how the country was governed, go to the ballot box and change who you vote for. These days, democracy is being questioned as a system.
And legitimately questioned, I think, Baltimore. Because if you look at it, there was a time when governments were the arbitrator between the interests of profit and potentially greed in the marketplace and the interests of citizens. And the governments were independent and arbitrated those interests and created social cohesion. What's happening today in the world, I mean, not unique in South Africa, is money dictates who gets into power. So you have a Donald Trump rising to power in the United States, and his explicit intention is to make himself the richest man in the world. And you know, if you have the same here in terms of our politicians, it seems like we are now in a context of a transactional state, that senior officials and public office bearers, a large number of them, seem to have the sole intention of enriching themselves while doing government business.
Yes, but what they say is that they have at least the intention now to throw land at the problem, and I'm not suggesting that land is an insignificant issue, but most people in this country, even the young activists, are asking for jobs and equality, not land. How important is land to solve that problem?
I think land is fundamental. Land is fundamental to citizenship. I am working in the Eastern Free State in a place called Rustlers Valley, just outside of Vicksburg. And I'm working with communities of farm workers that have been historically been evicted. And in that conversation that I have with them, in a farm that is a non-profit trust that I'm part of buying, their first conversation was that we are so tired of being evicted from our homes. Can we, first of all, negotiate with you transfer of land so we can own the land on which our homes are? And that's what we did. And secondly, if you look at land, there's so much unutilized land. If we want to tackle hunger in this country and increase agriculture's contribution to the GDP of this country, we should be working with these communities, and government in particular should be coming to the table to put money into these communities so that they can own land, they can have money for building their seed banks, their nurseries, to be able to have irrigation and to have water and some power, and then to negotiate with the market so that they get a fair price for their projects that they don't need and consume in their homes.
So what you describe will require a significant change in the country, and you write about CODESA way back as a process which yielded some meaningful,
yes,
at least a peaceful transition, right? But there's no consensus these days, right, about what kind of change it is that we need in this country. How do we forge a new consensus?
Well, I think that basically we must stop waiting for government. Government will follow things that will happen if we do things as citizens. In the context of land, because one of the first things we did as a community in the Eastern Free State is join the Free State Farmers Land Board and become members of it. And then they start talking to the leadership of the Free State Farmers Land Board. And now, actually, we're in discussions with Agri-SA through the Mandela Foundation and supported by a range of organizations, saying to white farmers, what is the most important thing you need in your life? We need security. We need to increase the role of agriculture in our economy. And already they have committed in discussions with ourselves to say there are members, white farmers, who are prepared to do the right thing today. The critical issue is they don't know how to do it, how to work with farm workers around the transfer of certain amount of land to help them build them as smallholder farmers and help give them access to the market to sell their produce. Now, this is what we've got to do as citizens, and we cannot wait for leaders any longer.
Mr. Naidoo, thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much.
Dit was die struggle-icoon Jay Naidoo oor sy nuwe boek Change.